Hi all, Dr. Clark here again for animal biology today. We're going to kind of talk about evolution, but mainly just the history of evolution. Like, how did modern evolution or the concepts of evolution come about? So who are the major players? And just kind of some background to keep you kind of give you an understanding of, the avenues at which evolution was discovered, at least some pieces of it, and kind of the role that certain individuals played in that. So first of all, we should start with kind of the definition of evolution. So I start with naming evolution mainly organic evolution because so many companies out there use the term evolution. So, they basically say their brand is evolving or the company is evolving and these kind of things. So scientists have now placed organic evolution in front of the word evolution because evolution for a scientist or for a biologist is very different than just change. You can have lots of change in an organism, even in a population. But if it's not changing the genes, the actual genetic makeup of the population, it's not evolution. Okay? So organic evolution, that idea and that hypothesis was originally put forth by Charles Darwin, okay? With one of the most famous quotes being descent with modification. In other words, all organisms are related on the planet. They all share common ancestors, and through minute changes over long periods of time, millions of years, these minute changes add up and they change the makeup, the genetic makeup. We now know it's the genetic makeup. Darwin didn't know that at the time. He would say it was the morphological makeup or the physiological makeup. Morphology meaning the physical features, physiology meaning like the chemical features or how those physical features work. He said that those were changing over a long period of time. But we now know that it's actually the genes that control those. Morphology, physical features, or physiology, okay, and even behavioral. It's the genes that control those that's changing over time. Okay? So populations change over time, and Darwin noticed this, and he noticed this from his time in the Galapagos and South America, and then just asking lots of questions to all kinds of scientists all over the world. He collected massive amounts of evidence for organic evolution, or change in populations genetics over time. Okay? So remember, individuals can't evolve. Now, individuals can change, but evolution is based on a population changing, not an individual changing. All right, so prior to Darwin and his hypotheses, which eventually became theories, there were other scientists that had ideas about change, either organismal change, population change, phylum changes, even sometimes they suggested that kingdoms could change. Okay? So we can talk about a couple of Greek philosophers that kind of had some of these ideas. Empedocles, his ideas early on were that things could change. However, most of his ideas were that a higher being, God, was doing the changing. Same thing with Aristotle. Aristotle, though, noticed that small changes could occur in an organism's lifetime, and he didn't quite contribute those to God's hand per se on every single change. He just assumed that God gave the ability for that organism to change. Okay? So the Greek philosophers were really wrapped around religion And they had this idea of change in populations. They saw organisms change over time. They saw populations change, whether that be coloration or, just like size of organisms were changing in different regions and things like that. So they noticed that things could change, but they contributed directly to a higher being. Okay. Then along came a few other individuals like Ernest Darwin, who is Charles Darwin's grandfather. Ernest Darwin was a physician. He was also a poet. He also talked a lot about evolution. Okay? So we sometimes think that Charles Darwin coined the term evolution, but that's not true. Evolution had been used as a term for changes in an organism for a very, very long time, including Charles Darwin's father. So Ernest Darwin, he was also a very religious man, but he noticed that certain things should not be explained by religion per se. Okay? That those minute changes that you would see in an organism over its lifetime were probably not the result of a higher being changing it. So kind of like Aristotle, but to a more scientific degree, Ernest Darwin was interested in this change. He still contributed a lot of the ability to change and a lot of large-scale changes, which we call macroevolution, to a higher being. But microevolution, some of the smaller changes, he said, well, it's probably just built into the organism's design. Okay? So the reason why I bring up Ernest Darwin is this is probably where Charles Darwin first heard the term evolution. Okay? Because Ernest Darwin wrote about it, he had poetry about evolution, etc. Ernest Darwin also had some of the same kind of ideas as Lamarckian or Lamarck did. And probably if you've taken a science class before, you've probably heard of Lamarck. Lamarck had some what we now realize kind of bizarre ideas when it comes to change, and that was that Lamarck said if an organism needs to change to survive, it will. So in other words, he has some classic examples of like giraffes feeding from a tree, and if all of a sudden all the branches that are low enough for the giraffe to reach, they've all been eaten, then some of the giraffes, the most superior individuals, will stretch their necks further. They will grow their necks even further so they can feed higher on the tree, and on and on and on. And so he was known to come up with this idea of acquired characteristics. And so if your mother or father could feed from the top of the tree, and they did so by extending their neck even further, growing their neck after it reached maximum length, and then growing it even further, then their offspring were going to inherit that capability. Okay? A lot of Lamarckian's ideas really came from society, okay? So human societies, and that he made the connection between education and wealth with parents. So he would often say and wrote, if your parents are wealthy, then the children will be wealthy, and that's an acquired characteristic. If your parents are educated, then the children would be educated, and that's an acquired characteristic. And so he felt that simple things that are controlled, like wealth and education, which are not physical features or physiological features, they could be inherited by children, and the same thing would happen in organisms throughout the world. And so he would say, like, if you're a thief when you're a child, or when your parents is one of your parents are a thief, okay, and they have their arm cut off or hand cut off, then the child has basically a good chance of being born without an arm, right, without a hand, so an acquired characteristic. Right? It was later, lots of experiments had been done. Rats were bred, they'd cut their tails off, breed them, cut both tails off, breed them, and realized that none of the rats would ever come out without a tail. And so there's a lot of scientists that debunked or rejected Lamarckian ideas. But really, until Charles Darwin came about, right, until Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by means of natural selection, Lamarckian ideas of acquired characteristics were that was the key. That was, the idea that was most accepted by the scientific community. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Charles Darwin and what led him to the idea of evolution by means of natural selection. So first of all, Darwin was born in 1809, died in 1882. He was born extremely wealthy. And so his grandfather was a physician, so was his father. And so being wealthy, he went to boarding schools. Now, Darwin was a pretty poor student when it comes down to it. He was like the equivalent of maybe a C student today that's disengaged. He really didn't want to go to school. He wanted to be outside collecting insects or, looking in streams, running around marshes, climbing trees, these kind of things. So he really wasn't interested in being in school at all. But nonetheless, he passed school, and his father said that a noble person in England at this time has two career choices. Either you could be a physician, a doctor, or you could be a clergyman, a man of religion. Those were your options. So Charles Darwin initially chose medical school. So he went to Edinburgh Medical School. And you have to think about this time period. Okay? We're talking the early 1800s, the 1820s, okay? And the amount of anesthesia, the amount of advances in the medical field was very limited. Right? This was before anesthesia had been developed, so alcohol was often used. It was a bad time, especially if you were afraid of blood. And Charles Darwin, I don't know if he was afraid of blood, but he didn't like human suffering, and he didn't like medical school at all. So if someone was going to have their leg amputated, it was bite down on this, we're going to cut this off, you're going to pass out, we'll stop the bleeding by cauterizing the wound, and then you'll be on your way. And a lot of people died or got infections on the operating table because we didn't know about passing bacteria from one surgery to the next, these kind of things, blood disorders, blood diseases, these kind of things. We didn't know anything about it at the time. So medical school really was not for Charles Darwin. He didn't like it at all, so he dropped out. So his next choice was to go to be a clergyman. And so he went to Christ College, Cambridge, and he found it more enjoyable than med school, but still didn't enjoy it at all. The one piece that he did enjoy was, at the time in the 1800s, most of the what we call naturalists, or the individuals that we now would probably consider ecologists, or individuals that study the interaction between organisms and the environment, most of those individuals were religious individuals. Okay, so either monks or clergymen or something along those lines, because, maybe because they had some time on their hands, but also because they were documenting at the time what was believed all of God's creations. So they were documenting and trying to catalog all the organisms on the planet. Darwin loved this piece. Okay, so Darwin would go out and collect insects and collect plants and look at insect-plant relationships and all kinds of things while he was going to the college in Cambridge. Okay? And it was there that he got nominated by Henslow, who was a professor at the College of Cambridge, to serve as the naturalist on the HMS Beagle. Okay? So Fitzroy, who was the captain of the HMS Beagle, he was looking for a naturalist, because at the time, whenever a large ship, large vessel went out to do whatever they're going to do, most of the time when they're exploring new regions, things like that, they would take a naturalist with them so that individual could document the vegetation and the animals at the new region that they discovered. So Fitzroy was looking for a naturalist, and I will tell you that Darwin was not the first choice, not by any means. He was a long ways down the list. Okay? And Fitzroy finally got this recommendation or nomination by Henslow, and so he asked Darwin to do it. Now, I should say that when Darwin originally liked the idea of this, he was all in, but Darwin had to come up with the money, so he had to actually pay Fitzroy to go on the boat and become the naturalist. But Darwin didn't have any money, so he had to ask his father for the money. And his father said, no, you can't go on this, except for after a long conversation, his father said, if you can find one person that I respect as an individual that thinks it's a good idea that you go on this voyage, then I'll pay for you to go on. So he went to his uncle, which also was his father-in-law. Okay, so Darwin married his cousin, and that's a later date when he comes back from the voyage. But he went to his uncle, and he asked him if he would kind of give his blessing and tell his father, hey, this is a good idea. And his uncle did. He said that it would be a good idea for an individual to go on a trip like this. It could allow him to clear his head and figure out what he's good at and these kind of things. So Darwin's father paid the money, and Darwin went on the Beagle. Now, I should say, Darwin being one of the last choices, the reason why he was one of the last choices was Fitzroy was telling individuals that it would be a 2-year voyage. And most naturalists knew that there was no way, because Fitzroy's job, what he was trying to do, was to map the coastlines of all the continents. Okay, so he's going to map all of South America, he's going to map Australia, India, Africa, and he's going to map all the port cities and kind of the geology, where could you get in, where, what was the tidal zones like, etc., all in 2 years. And the naturalist he asked before knew that he was out of his mind. There was no way it was going to take 2 years to do this. Okay? So all of them turned him down, and Darwin, being kind of green, he was only 22 years old, he decided, sure, okay, I'll go for it. I don't really care, and he went. Okay? Now, when he came back from the voyage in 1836, he had collected a lot of data, and most people know the date of 1859 is actually when he published his book on the origins of species by means of natural selection. He waited 16 years, roughly 16 years, before he published his book. Okay? Now, it depends on who you talk to on whether this was because he didn't have enough data or why he waited. Most historians, most individuals who have looked at this, believe, at least in part, that he waited because he knew that once he published his book, that his family would be outcasted by the church. Right? That the writings in his book would be seen as going against the religious doctrine of the time, and he'd be outcasted and ridiculed by the church. And so, because his wife, Emma Darwin, was a devout Christian and extremely religious, he waited so, basically he didn't harm her or outcast his family. Even though Darwin, basically when he came back from the Voyage of the Beagle, he didn't go to church again. Right? He would walk his family to church. They would go inside. He would walk around the countryside collecting data, these kind of things, writing, these kind of things. But he never really went back to church. And he was not a religious man, and he didn't believe in religion after his trip on the Beagle. Now, a lot of the writing suggests that Emma Darwin actually forced Darwin to publish his book. Okay? Another piece comes in, though, is in 1858, Darwin got a letter from Alfred Russel Wallace that outlined kind of the same ideas of evolution by means of natural selection. Okay? So between Emma, Darwin pushing him, saying, hey, you need to publish this. You've been sitting on it for a long time. It's your life work. I don't care if the church outcasts us. Just publish it. And other people encroaching on his idea, Darwin finished his book in 1859. It took him 1 year to write it, but it was really already wrote in about 1842. He had already wrote the whole thing. And so it was published in 1859. So this is the voyage that he went on. Okay, he left England. Okay, went to South America. Made numerous stops. Fitzroy made numerous stops along South America. They visited lots of tribes. Okay, lots of areas, lots of ports, etc. And they didn't make it to the Cape until they were already 2 years in. Okay, so Fitzroy said the whole trip around would take 2 years, and he only got to South America, the tip of South America, in 2 years. So really, after that piece, they started to hurry, okay? And their ports became a lot shorter. Darwin's most famous for the Galapagos Islands, but he only spent about 30 days in the islands, okay? And he didn't go to all the islands. Okay? There are 13 islands, or 13 main islands, and he didn't visit all of them. Okay? So, he's famous for it, but, a lot of the time was not really spent there. It was that he collected massive amounts of material and sent it back, and then then he carried on. Okay? And you can see that after, the Galapagos Islands, they didn't make very many stops. Okay? They skipped a lot of Australia. Okay? They didn't even get into India or Sri Lanka or anywhere up there. They didn't even stop in Africa, and they came pretty much right back. In the end, it was a 5-year trip. Okay? So when Darwin got back, he started writing up his theory of evolution by means of natural selection, along with a lot of other things. Okay? His very first kind of publication was on atolls, which are these kind of donut-looking areas of coral reefs. So if you look at a coral reef, a lot of times you can find these coral patches where they're perfect circles and there's nothing in the middle. It's just water. And so he wrote about how this occurs. Now, originally what occurred is that the coral went all the way around an island. And the coral was making a reef completely around the island. And then the island eroded away, and the island is now underwater, but the coral's still there. So it's not that the coral grows in a circle. It's that the island disappeared in the center, and now you have water in the center. Okay. And so he wrote about that, and that was really his first publication, but he wrote a lot lot of publications, lots of books, etc. in his lifetime. All right, so how did he develop some early ideas of evolution? Probably the first and main piece really came with geology. Right? So at the time that Darwin was around, there was this idea that the Earth was 6,000 years old, and that was put forth by a man named William Paley, who was a religious man, and just to get at the age of the Earth, he tracked the Bible backwards. And so he tracked the generations backwards and figured out, based on the generations in the Bible, etc., the Earth was roughly 4,000 to 6,000 years old. Well, Darwin had been reading lots of geology books, and the geologists knew for a long time that there is no way that the Earth could only be 4,000 or 6,000 years old. Because in order for things like the Grand Canyon to form, and we know what erosion rates are from streams and rivers and things like that, there's no way that you could cut that deep, okay, through the Earth in 4,000 years old. 4,000 years. Same thing with the erosion of volcanoes and mountains and the formation of mountains and things like that. Geologists knew for a long time that it's just not possible. So Darwin was reading books by like Hutton and a few other geologists that suggested that the Earth was over 100 million years old, if not hundreds of millions of years old. Okay, they didn't know how old the planet was, but they knew that the features that they were examining, there's no way they could occur in 4,000 to 6,000 years. So Darwin determined, after reading most of the geology books, etc., that Earth had to be much older than 6,000 years old. So this kind of gave him the idea that, well, if it's really old, and it's going to take a lot of small changes to show differences in organisms, then maybe that's enough time for these organisms to change. And so he would ask questions, and he asked a very famous question: if geology can change over hundreds of millions of years, then why can't living organisms, living forms, change as well? Okay. Another piece really came from geology, but it came from fossil evidence. Mainly South American fossils, mainly because that's where they stopped, is South America, pretty much. But Darwin would examine fossils that occur in the same region that the living organisms did. So, in other words, Darwin discovered this species here, which is the giant ground sloth, Megatherium darwinii, okay, which was named by Richard Owens, who at the time was the curator of the Natural History Museum. Okay. He named it for Darwin because Darwin was the discoverer. Okay. In the same region that Megatherium darwinii was found, Darwin found two-toed sloths in the same region, modern two-toed sloths. And he realized that, look, yes, this is much bigger, yes, it's a little bit different, but they're pretty much the same. Okay? Apart from that, he also found Glophodont, which are giant armadillos. They're fossils right next to modern armadillos that were running, on the tops of the banks where these fossils were found. So the fossil evidence was starting to pile up. The other pieces of evidence was that Darwin was looking at living organisms in the different regions. He's most famous for the Galapagos Islands, and a lot of credit is given to the Galapagos finches, or what's sometimes called the Darwin's finches, but most of the early evidence were from the Galapagos tortoise. Darwin talked to native residents on different islands, and they could tell what island a tortoise shell came from. So when a tortoise was killed, or etc., what island did it come from? Because of the saddle. So this is the saddle, this region here, of the shell. If the saddle was big and and high, that meant the tortoise had the ability to reach up its neck much higher and feed in branches or small cacti and things like that are growing above the head of the tortoise. If the saddle was small, like this one, it means that the tortoise was eating green plants on the ground, okay, on these different islands. Okay? And Darwin noticed this and suggested, well, based on this, it looks like Galapagos tortoises can change, okay, over long periods of time depending on the island in which they inhabit. The next piece of evidence was not directly related to Darwin. Later it was, the discovery was. But when Darwin went to these islands, he shot lots of birds. And so at the time, you have to think about collections. Collections were done mainly with a shotgun. You just go out, you shoot every bird you find or see, okay, you collect them, you send them back, etc. And someone was going to categorize what that was. And that's exactly what was occurring with Charles Darwin. So when he was looking at ground finches and woodpecker finches and warbler finches and cactus finches and things like that, he didn't know that they're all finches. Right? Darwin was not an ornithologist. He actually knew very little about birds. He, recognized what they fed on and kept good documents of what they were feeding on at the time, kind of what their bill shapes were, etc. And, some of them he labeled them as, like, woodpeckers, and some he labeled as warblers, and some he labels as finches, and some he labeled as sparrows. And so he didn't really know they're all finches. When they all got back to the museum, okay, the curator, the ornithologist at the time, okay, Bell, examined them all and then wrote to Charles Darwin and said, hey, these are all finches. They're all in the same group, every one of them. So it was that connection that, whoa, wait, if these are all finches, this is a result of a finch from the mainland in Ecuador being carried out to the islands, either through some kind of storm, something like that, got out to the islands, and then went through what we call adaptive radiation. All these new habitats were open for them to adapt to. Now, in many cases, what happens is all the organisms die. The finches would never make it. But in some cases, they have the ability or have a mutation that pops up often enough that their bill, in this case we know what mutation it was, their bill shape could change to fit the diet or fit the most abundant organisms in that region. And so they exploded. And you have lots of species of finches on the islands, and mainly one finch, okay, or one ancestral species on the mainland. Okay. After all that, we now know, since kind of the early 2000s, when genetic technology got to be good enough, we could examine, well, what differs in the finches? Okay, what controls that difference in bill shape? Okay, and we now know that it's a gene that codes for BMP4, okay, which is a protein that deposits in the bill of the birds and causes the bill to become either thicker or thinner, etc. And whenever it's turned on, okay, if it's turned on early and it's on the whole time, okay, the gene is on the whole time, then the bill is going to be bigger. If it's turned off, it's going to be smaller, okay? And these manipulations of this gene cause these different shapes to the bill. Okay, Darwin didn't know that because Darwin didn't even know genes or genetics existed. Okay, but he knew that based on classification by ornithologists, these were all finches, and they all had different bill shapes. Okay, so here you can see there's just a huge variety of Galapagos finches, from warblers to cactus finches to finches that have similar bills as, say, a raven or a crow, to ground finches that are cracking seeds, woodpecker finches that can use tools, Okay, insectivorous finches that are, similar to warblers. They eat insects, but in just different insects, different types of insects, different regions. Vegetarian finches. So there's just a huge variety that you find on the Galapagos Islands. Okay? We now know, based on genetic analysis, that they're all related to an ancestral finch from Ecuador. Okay, so further evidence that Darwin suggested for the theory of evolution by means of natural selection came from another theory, which is artificial selection. So Darwin noticed that humans had been manipulating dogs for a very long period of time. And all dogs come from the ancestor of wolves, okay? And from wolves particularly. So all dog breeds that we currently see. And it was, the result of artificial selection that gave you all the varieties of dogs. And we'd only been doing it for like 200 years. Okay? Now, other kinds of artificial selection, Darwin had, much more evidence and had a first-hand knowledge of. Okay, he bred horses. Okay? He also knew and established pigeons and bred pigeons, and so he knew a lot of people that bred pigeons and rabbits, and there was a lot of other artificial selection that he knew about that he could suggest. Well, look, if humans can select for traits, then why can't nature select for traits? Okay? And then kind of the final piece that really pushed Darwin into thinking about natural selection and the theory of evolution was a book by Thomas Malthus on human populations. Okay? Now, Malthus was a population biologist, okay, if you want to say there were such things, but that's what he did. He examined populations, he examined trends of populations, and feeding trends and poverty and things like that. And Malthus wrote a book about populations of humans. And in his book, Malthus suggested that humans have the capability of over-reproduction. They reproduce more offspring than the food resources or the habitat resources can support. So a lot of them are going to go in poverty mode and starve and maybe even die. Okay? With diseases or whatever it might be, but the human population over-reproduces, and quite a few of those individuals will die. Okay? So when Darwin was reading this, he realized that humans, there's no real difference between human populations and all other organisms. So Darwin made the connection that if humans can do this, all populations can do this. All populations produce more offspring than are needed to keep the population at a stable stance. Okay? So in other words, let's take like robins, something very simple. Okay? A robin typically produces 4 eggs. Okay? But it only needs to produce 2 eggs that survive and mature to keep the population at the exact same level. So a robin produces 4 eggs at a time, normally. Okay? Now some of those are not going to make it. Some of those individuals are going to die. Okay? And it's only the individual that's best suited for the current environment that lives. Okay? And that's the means by natural selection. That's what evolution by natural selection is that genetically there's going to be differences between individuals that are born. Some will be better suited for the current environment. They'll have an advantage. They'll live. They'll pass their genes on. Their children, their offspring, will be better suited for the current environment. The environment changes. That trait that they had might not be suited any longer. Another trait would be, and that's why populations change over time. Okay? So, in order for the theory of evolution by natural selection to kind of be shown and supported by evidence in nature, okay, there's a couple things that Darwin pointed out organisms need in order to, have evolution by means of natural selection occur. First of all, you have to have high reproductive potential. Now, this may or may not be true. If you have high reproductive potential, you have the chance of changing more rapidly. Okay? But that's not to say that if you have low reproductive potential, like say elephants, which might produce 3-4 offspring in their entire life, that's not to say that they won't change. It just will take them much longer. We know this now. But Darwin at the time, high reproductive potential, because he could see the differences when you looked at high reproductive potential. Okay? Variation must be inherited. Okay? So whatever the character is that natural selection is taking hold of or acting upon, it must be inherited. Darwin didn't know that it must be genetically controlled by the germline cells, and the DNA in the sperm and egg must be what's controlling this variable. Okay? But he did know that you had to be able to pass a certain character on, okay, in order for natural selection to take hold. Okay, this came from Malthus's book, that there's basically a constant struggle for resources. That resources are limited, energy is limited, and lots of individuals are going to die in that population. The individuals that are best suited for the environment will get more resources, they'll live, they'll pass their genes on. Okay? Because they will live, that means they're more adaptive to the current environment, and therefore that trait will be more common in the next generations or in generations to come. Okay? And so these are really the keys that Darwin put forth for the theory of evolution by means of natural selection. Okay? So, in other words, this is where adaptation comes about. Okay? Darwin noticed that organisms, okay, that had adaptations or had features that gave them an increased chance of reproduction were the organisms that were going to be more persistent in an environment. Okay? So an adaptation is something that exists that gives an organism an advantage in reproductions. Okay? So it's really about reproduction. Because you need to pass those genes on to the next generation. Okay? So there's lots of examples you can think about them. I mean, snowshoe hares, you can think about Arctic foxes, you can think about lots and lots of examples. And in particular, any feature that you can see currently on an organism may have been an adaptation at one time, okay, that was advantageous in the environment. Okay? Now there are some vestigial characteristics. We'll talk about these. These characteristics are things that are left over from previous ancestry that really have very little function, like the coccyx and things like that. But nonetheless, at one time, that coccyx being a tail, at one time that gave us an advantage, not as a human, okay, but as our ancestors, okay, far removed ancestors, okay, we're talking, maybe 50 million years ago ancestors, they used tails, okay, they used tails for balance, prehensile tails potentially, okay, these kind of things, and we have no use for them, but they did at the time. Okay? So the great thing about adaptations, the great thing about this situation is that they're all the result of minute changes in DNA. We know this now. Darwin didn't know it at the time, but minute changes in DNA, which we call mutations, give a different protein, okay, a different arrangement of amino acids, which can result in an adaptation, which can result in a new phenotype. Now, a lot of the mutations are not advantageous. They might be maladaptive. They might cause you to be actually not adapted to the environment. So let's say, a snowshoe hare mutates and it does not have the temperature control gene anymore. Okay? and now it's dark on a white background. Well, those individuals are not going to last very long in in an environment. Okay? But let's say, all organisms, all rabbits, okay, in this environment have dark, and the mutation caused them to have a temperature sensitive gene that turns on and off. Okay? It turns off when it's cold, and so there's no pigment in the coat, and it turns on when it's warm, and so the coat becomes pigmented. Now this gives the individual an advantage. Successful reproduction is going to occur, and the population is going to change. Okay? Now, once those mutations occur, again, like I said, an advantage for reproduction occurs, okay? Because natural selection is selecting against some adaptation, either the non-ability to change coat color, okay? And so it just increases the likelihood for those genes to be passed on. All right, the final thing I really want to talk about, and final individual, is an individual that often doesn't get very much credit, but needs probably not equal credit as Charles Darwin for the theory of evolution by means of natural selection, but at least some credit, is Alfred Russel Wallace. So he came up with the theory of evolution by means of natural selection at the same kind of general time as Charles Darwin. So he's the one that wrote Darwin a letter in 1858 suggesting that species had the ability to change, that nature was doing the changing, etc. And in fact, Alfred Russel Wallace is the individual that coined the term natural selection. Okay? It wasn't Darwin's term. Darwin utilized it, and they published material together, and they were actually pretty cordial between each other. And often it's thought that Wallace, was forgotten and Darwin got all the credit, but every medal and award that Darwin won for the theory of evolution by means of natural selection, so did Wallace. Okay? But Wallace was an introvert, much more than Darwin. Right? Darwin was an introvert, but he was at least cordial and was nice about it. Wallace, he didn't want any credit. He hated medals. He hated awards. He hated going places and talking to people about biology and things like that. So he was really kind of removed from the scene, and he removed himself from the scene. So again, they published their ideas jointly. Darwin, it's thought was his hand was kind of forced by Wallace to write his book on the origin of species. Okay, and Darwin's given most of the credit because he had 16 plus years of work when Wallace had a couple, two years of work or so. And Darwin had a lot more evidence than Wallace did. Okay, and so that's why Wallace really doesn't get as much credit as Darwin, but when individuals talk about the theory of evolution by means of natural selection, they need to include both individuals, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, as the co-founders of the theory of evolution by means of natural selection. Okay? With that, we're now going to switch gears a little bit, and I'll talk about evidence for evolution. So what do we have now that we didn't have during Darwin's time? And then on top of it, what did Darwin have, more evidence that Darwin had for the theory of evolution by means of natural selection, or just for evolutionary change. Okay? All right, next time we'll pick up evidence of evolution.